Right, so this is the fifth part of the Kilmore story, and it's called The End Game. Mum and Dad went back to Ireland at the end of January 1992, and I was in increasing trouble at school. The bursar said she wanted the use of the school car, something I had had the use of for more than a year. She had her way, of course. I started to cycle to school. I knew the end game had begun. Things were brought to a head by the most infamous of all the incidents that happened at my time at the school. This was an incident in the staff room involving Rasputin. One day I was in the staff room with most of the other staff at break time, about 10 of us, 12 of us. Suddenly, Rasputin began ranting in a loud voice, in a strident tone, in what appeared to be some sort of prepared speech. After a short while, I realized that this speech was an attack on me and my leadership. Basically, I was being accused of not consulting with staff on a range of issues. After he'd finished his tirade, most curiously, he then asked me directly what I was doing in school on Saturday mornings. This was an absurd question to any balanced individual, as it was obvious to all what a principal might be doing on a Saturday morning in a school. Working, of course. Being in school on Saturday morning is something one normally expects to be applauded for. But in the atmosphere of that school, this was apparently a suspicious activity to Rasputin. It certainly was to Rasputin, the blowfly's lab dog. Both Rasputin and the blowfly were now suspicious of me. A few days previously, they had changed the lock on the business office door. I can only think they didn't want others, particularly myself maybe, to have access to the papers inside, although I never went in there. Frankly, it didn't bother me that they'd changed the lock, as I never went in there anyway. Anyway, the abrasive and disrespectful tone of his speech was such that the rest of the staff were, of course, acutely embarrassed and quite naturally began to leave the room. I asked him to come and speak with me in my office, but no, he wouldn't do that. He only wanted to rant if there was an audience, like a typical bully. He was the classic bully, of course, and nothing more than a stooge and lapdog of the blowfly. He'd sold himself to them many years ago. He just wanted to demonstrate to everyone how important he was and that he could say anything to anybody at any time. What better way to do it than to rant at the principal in front of everybody else? The blowfly thought he was indispensable. I suppose Hitler also thought Goebbels and Goering were indispensable. Anyway, Rasputin was wrong. He was wrong and eventually sacked by the blowfly himself, like everyone else, some time after I had left. In my view, though, this incident was very serious for me because it upset our small staff and undermined my authority to the point where I felt I could not carry on unless something was done about him. I thought my position was untenable. I got in touch with the chemist, who was acting chairman of the board in the chairman's absence, when the latter was too busy to come to the school, which was almost always the case. In fact, I only ever saw the chairman twice at the school in my 20 months there. In classic Nixon fashion, I then made one or two tactical mistakes, which were to make things much worse for me. First, the next day I was sick. I suppose I could have gone to the school, but I really wasn't well with some gastric issue, although it probably looked to everyone like I had been run off the premises. I negotiated with the chemist about the Rasputin rant over the phone from my house. I was insisting he do something about Rasputin. His behavior had been thoroughly unprofessional and required a serious sanction. In the end, he agreed to investigate. He made an investigation and decided that Rasputin's behavior was totally unacceptable. However, as usual, the problem was what could be done, as Rasputin was the blowfly's stooge. While I was still in my house, the chemist had a meeting with all the staff, assuring them that I was coming back and that Rasputin would have to apologise to me for his outburst. I was initially pleased with this. I certainly believed the chemist. Whether or not he ever had the intention of making Rasputin apologise or not, I don't know. But it never happened. There was no apology. I certainly didn't think that the chemist would not back up his words with actions. As it turned out, he simply asked Rasputin to apologize without insisting that it be done in his presence as a witness. The result was, of course, that Rasputin said yes, he would apologize, but didn't do it. Moreover, when I suggested that he come to the office and apologize in front of a witness, he did come to the office, but not only refused to apologize, but also refused to give a guarantee that he would not repeat the behavior. Things were at crisis point. When I told the chemist that I insisted on an apology as my position was untenable, the chemist then said he couldn't make him apologize. This changed things entirely for me. The staff were under the impression, having been told by the chemist, the deputy chairman of the board himself, that Rasputin had indeed admitted his unprofessional behavior and apologized to me for it. But the reality was he had not done it. On the contrary, he clearly stated he had no intention of even pulling his head in. My position was untenable. The chairman could not be contacted as usual. I went back to work after a couple of days, and the blowfly and his wife continued to play their games. The next move was to stop the mail going into my office. A lot of my work was generated from the mail. Blowfly started to intercept the mail and divert it to my assistant. When I realized what was happening, I asked her to redirect the mail, and which was had been redirected to her by the blowfly's office. This was only partially effective, and it started to cause strain between my assistant and myself. In retrospect, I see that this, of course, is exactly why the blowfly did it. Although I could not see this clearly at the time, I realized in retrospect that the blowfly's tactics were very clever. He knew I had a good relationship with my assistant, and I don't think neither she nor I could see clearly at first that he was going to do his best to sabotage it. He was successful eventually. However, I did see what he was up to, and I became frustrated with my assistant because I thought she did not see what the blowfly was doing. The blowfly was clearly building a case to the board that I wasn't doing any work and that my assistant was doing it. In fact, it was true to a certain extent because he'd redirected the mail. She was getting the mail and much of the work generated from it, although she was redirecting some of it to me. Sometime later, the wedge was firmly driven between my assistant and I when the chemist informed me subsequently that my assistant had been given extra money during these last few weeks for her extra responsibilities, quote unquote. My assistant denied requesting this money. I don't know whether she received it or not. For me, this was the last straw. The chemist's words and his lack of action over Rasputin acted on me like a slow poison. I came to believe both the chemist and my assistant were going to just watch as the blowfly did with me what he wanted. In the chemist's case, he was just going to try to keep me in place until the smooth operator arrived from Hamburg. I thought my assistant would wring her hands, but probably stay in place until the smooth operator arrived from Germany. I began to suspect treachery from all sides. I was certainly in the process of some sort of breakdown or anxiety attack, one of the characteristics of which is paranoia. This type of anxiety attack has subsequently recurred from time to time in my career, causing me bother both at work and at home with my family. I have learned to control it with counseling and sometimes medication. But my tolerance to stress certainly decreased after this traumatic episode. I also started to drink too much alcohol at this time, not in binges, but on a daily basis in order to anesthetize myself from my trials and to get some sleep. The alcohol only increased my irritability. By the time the smooth operator arrived in March from Hamburg for a visit, I had had enough. Mentally, I was exhausted and beaten. I could see no point in staying on until July, when my contract was up. I felt increasingly isolated. I had become estranged from my assistant. She could do nothing except watch. I went to the chairman, but he seemed to just want me to hold on as well until the smooth operator came permanently in July. In fact, this seemed to be everyone's strategy. I could see this would be an ideal scenario for them all. I now knew the blowfly and his wife were basically vampires, and no one could work with them. I knew my contract would not be renewed. Some excuse would be found to get rid of me. They now had the assistant to do my job. In the end, I was convinced none of them would care. Yes, they would wring their hands and say how awful it all was. But in the end, it would be me left in the middle of the bush with no job. The mind games of the blowfly continued. They were absurd. Each day in my office, the blowfly would pull up my blinds as he passed by, just so he could look in, just to unnerve me. I was, and still am convinced, that he punctured my bicycle tire with a drawing pin one day so that I could not get home. Who knows whether he did it or not? Such was my paranoid state of mind. In desperation, I sent a fax to the smooth operator and another one to the chairman, castigating them both for their lack of support and lack of action, against this continued intimidation by the blowfly. With his latter facts, I think I burned my boats with the chairman. I remember my exact words. With a little Irish melodrama, I announced in the facts that, quote, if he continued to procrastinate and prevaricate any more, his soul would roast in hell. These words are indicative of my state of mind at the time. I didn't realize it at the time, but the truth is there was not very much the chairman could now do about it. It was far, far too late to do anything. And things turned out as I had predicted. The smooth operator arrived in March. I told him what had happened with Rasputin. I said I wanted to resign immediately as my position was no longer tenable. The blowfly and the bursar and the chemist heard, he heard their side of the story. I don't know what he believed, but he certainly didn't understand at that time what the blowfly and his wife were like and what was in front of him. He did later, of course, as he fell out of them within a few months and resigned himself, like everyone else who worked for the blowfly. I don't know what my assistant said either, but I'm confident that she would not have undermined me by anything she said. And I know the other senior female members of staff spoke in my defense. But it was all pointless and too late. The new plan of the smooth operator was quite simple. I was to resign, and that would be a major problem solved for them, for everyone, except myself. My assistant would take over till July, when the smooth operator arrived permanently, or so he thought at the time. That is exactly what happened. The smooth operator went back to Germany to finish his contract, and the chemist was asked to handle my departure. This he did with aplomb. I was effectively escorted off the premises by the chemist in the time-honored fashion of other administrators of this international school, quickly to be ignored and forgotten like the rest. We were left high and dry in our house, not 200 meters from the school. The most painful thing about the next few weeks was the complete absence of communication from anybody connected with the school. If things had been bad up until now, they were about to get much, much worse. Maria and I agree that the next year in particular, in fact the next few months, were perhaps the most unhappy of our lives. Starting almost immediately, there was total silence from everyone we knew. Just like in the literature and the books you read, all the colleagues and people who had been friendly towards us appeared to disown us. Nothing from the chairman, nothing from the chemist, nothing from the secretaries, nothing from the teachers. Even my assistant didn't visit us. There was no one connected with the school who had anything to do with us, apart from the other senior female teacher who did make it her business to come and visit us. We just became invisible non-citizens in the literal sense of the word, even to our neighbours, one of whom was a teacher at the school and with whom I thought I had a good relationship. We were completely cold-shouldered, and I was never so miserable. Everything began to disintegrate around us. I lost my confidence in myself, and I don't think I've ever completely recovered it. Strangely enough, the only people who took an interest in us were the government Social Security Office. They were excellent, and I will always be grateful for the sensitive way in which I was processed to receive the dole by Centrelink. It was, of course, a Labour government at that time. I wouldn't like to have been in this position with the parasitic Conservative government of John Howard, which was to follow for the next decade. It has always been a paradox. There was a marked contrast between the way in which my colleagues and associates at school reacted to our situation and the way the state reacted. The latter could not have been more supportive, whereas the former just vanished into thin air. I decided to act decisively. Some might say I panicked. Sometimes there's not a lot of difference. I went to Ireland to apply for work in an overseas setting, but everything seemed to conspire against me. I arrived home in Belfast to find that a school in the Canary Islands, which was very suitable for me, had answered my application for deputy principal, and they just phoned Belfast 1 hour before my arrival from Australia, but my dear old mum had not asked for their number, so I could not call them back. It was just before Easter. They'd never called back, and when I called them, they were closed. I spent a frantic 2 weeks waiting for the phone call that never came. I expected the phone to ring any minute for the whole 2 weeks. It never did. In those days, there was no internet, so I could not get a contact number for the school. They must have appointed somebody else. I took a further decisive step. Panicked again, maybe, and visited the Yorkshireman, who was actually principal in Portugal at that time. This was a very long shot. He was now the head of that international school, but there were no jobs for me there, and he didn't know of any anywhere else. He himself was in a very bad state, one of the many victims of the blowfly. Back to Australia, and I took a further decisive step and immediately vacated the house at Bindley Court and moved into a very inferior one in Sutherland Street, quite close to the school. The rent was just $100 a week. I felt we didn't have enough money to stay in the other house. Well, it was true we didn't have much money, all right. But looking back, that was not a good decision. We should have stayed in that nice house in Bindley Court. The new one was cold, had rats in the back, and mice in the bedrooms. The kids didn't care, but Maria did. She hated that house. Maria is very easygoing and has a forgiving nature. But around this time, I noticed that she started to be negative about Australia too. Of all the places she has been to with me, Australia is still the only one to which she has said she would not like to stay in it. I applied for jobs all over the country and made nearly 120 hand-mailed applications to private schools in Australia. No computers in those days. No internet. There was almost no response to my letters. It was a very bad time economically in Australia. I came to dread the little stroll to my post box at the end of our driveway in Sutherland Street, to return clutching a handful of thin letters whose message was always the same. Thank you for your interest in the school, but the ones who bothered to reply, that is.